"John, this section's for immediate family only." My uncle snapped, pointing toward a shaky chair by the exit. Several relatives laughed. Then the staff brought over the $2,900 bill and set it in front of me. I smiled, stood up, and announced, "Good thing I'm not family, then I don't need to pay." I, 32M, never thought I'd be the one to burn bridges at a family funeral, but here we are. My grandmother passed away last month, and what should have been a time for grieving turned into the most satisfying revenge I've ever served cold. Let me back up. My grandmother raised me from age 8 after my parents died in a car accident. She was everything to me: mother, father, best friend, and the only person who truly understood me. When she got sick 3 years ago, I moved back to my hometown to take care of her. I quit my job in tech, sold my apartment, and became her full-time caregiver. My uncle, her eldest son, had been absent for most of her illness. He lived 2 hours away and visited maybe once every few months, always with excuses about work or his own family obligations. Meanwhile, I was there for every doctor's appointment, every sleepless night, every moment of pain and confusion as dementia slowly took her away from us. The rest of the family wasn't much better. Cousins who lived nearby rarely visited. My aunt, her daughter, would call occasionally but never offered real help. They all had their lives, their priorities, their reasons why caring for an elderly woman wasn't convenient for them. But I stayed. I held her hand through chemotherapy sessions. I learned to cook her favorite meals when she could barely keep food down. I sat with her during those long nights when she forgot who I was, patiently reminding her that I was her grandson who loved her more than anything in the world. When she passed, I was the one holding her hand. I was the one who made the funeral arrangements, chose the casket, wrote the obituary, and handled all the paperwork that comes with death. I did it all while grieving, while exhausted, while running on fumes and pure love for the woman who had given me everything. The funeral home was packed. Suddenly, all these relatives who couldn't be bothered to visit a dying woman appeared in their black suits and crocodile tears. They spoke about what a wonderful person she was, how much they'd miss her, how she was like a second mother to them. I wanted to scream. After the service, we gathered at the reception hall next door. The funeral director had set up a beautiful spread, her favorite flowers, a photo montage I'd put together, and tables arranged for the family meal. I'd specifically requested a private dining area for immediate family, knowing my grandmother would have wanted her closest loved ones to have a quiet space to remember her. That's when my uncle decided to make his power play. I was sitting at the main table, exhausted but trying to be present for the other mourners, when he approached me with that familiar condescending look. He told me that the section I was in was reserved for immediate family only, and pointed toward a wobbly chair by the exit where I apparently belonged. The way he said it, with such casual cruelty, made my blood run cold. Several relatives actually laughed. They found it amusing that the person who had sacrificed everything for their mother and grandmother was being relegated to the kids' table at her own funeral reception. I sat there for a moment, processing the sheer audacity of it all. Then the funeral home staff approached our table with the final bill. The total was $2,900 for the reception, flowers, catering, room rental, everything I had arranged and paid for in advance. But here's the thing. I had only put down a deposit. The balance was due at the end of the event. The staff member set the bill directly in front of me, assuming I would handle it just like I had handled everything else. My uncle glanced at it and made some comment about how expensive funerals had become, but made no move to contribute. None of them did. They just sat there, expecting me to pay for their meal while they excluded me from their table. That's when something clicked. I looked around at all these people who had treated me like an outsider, who had abandoned my grandmother when she needed them most, who were now literally pushing me away from the family table at her funeral. And I realized they had given me the perfect out. I smiled, probably the first genuine smile I'd had in weeks. I stood up slowly, making sure I had everyone's attention. Then I announced that since I apparently wasn't family, I didn't need to pay the family's bill either. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that reception hall. My uncle's face went from smug satisfaction to pure panic in about 2 seconds. The other relatives looked confused, then horrified as they realized what was happening. I told the staff member that there seemed to be some confusion about who was responsible for the bill, and that they should probably discuss payment arrangements with the immediate family members who were seated at the main table. Then I picked up my jacket and started walking toward the exit. My uncle jumped up and tried to backtrack, suddenly claiming he had misspoken, that of course I was family, that there had been a misunderstanding. But I was done. I told him that he had made it very clear where I stood in this family hierarchy, and I was simply respecting his wishes. The funeral director looked mortified. The staff didn't know what to do. The relatives were frantically whispering among themselves, trying to figure out how to handle a $2,900 bill they hadn't expected to pay. I walked out of that reception hall with my head held high for the first time in months. Behind me, I could hear my uncle desperately trying to negotiate with the funeral home staff, explaining that there had been a family dispute, asking if they could work out a payment plan. Update 1. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within an hour of leaving the reception, my phone started buzzing with angry calls and texts. My uncle was furious, demanding I come back and pay the bill. He accused me of being petty and disrespectful to my grandmother's memory. Other relatives chimed in, saying I was being childish and that family should stick together during difficult times. The irony wasn't lost on me. These same people who had just publicly excluded me from the family were now insisting I was family when it came to financial responsibility. I let most of the calls go to voicemail, but I did answer when my aunt called. She tried a different approach, playing the guilt card. She reminded me how much my grandmother had loved all of us, how she wouldn't have wanted the family to be divided like this. She suggested we could all chip in to cover the bill and move past this unfortunate incident. I listened patiently, then asked her a simple question. Where was all this family unity when my grandmother was dying? Where was this collective responsibility when she needed daily care, when she was scared and confused, when she was asking for her children and grandchildren who were too busy to visit? My aunt went quiet. She mumbled something about everyone having their own circumstances, their own challenges. I told her I understood completely. I had my own circumstances too, and right now, those circumstances didn't include paying for a reception where I wasn't welcome. The calls kept coming throughout the evening. Some relatives tried anger, others tried guilt, a few attempted bribery by promising to include me in family events going forward. But the damage was done. They had shown me exactly how they viewed me, and I had simply responded in kind. Update 2. 3 days later, I got a call from the funeral home director. He was apologetic and professional, explaining that the family had worked out a payment arrangement for the reception bill. Apparently, my uncle had to put it on his credit card, and the other relatives had agreed to reimburse him over time. The director also mentioned that there had been some heated discussions in the parking lot after I left, with family members arguing about who should pay what. I thanked him for letting me know and apologized for any inconvenience the situation had caused his staff. He assured me that family disputes weren't uncommon at funerals, though he admitted this was the first time he'd seen someone walk out on a bill they had originally arranged to pay. That same day, I received a certified letter from my uncle's lawyer. It was a formal demand for payment of the reception costs, claiming I had entered into a contract with the funeral home and was legally obligated to pay regardless of family dynamics. The letter threatened legal action if I didn't remit payment within 10 days. I took the letter to my own attorney, a friend from college who specialized in contract law. After reviewing the documentation, he laughed and told me the letter was mostly bluster. Since I had only paid a deposit and the final bill had been presented to the family as a group, there was no clear legal obligation for me to pay the full amount. More importantly, my uncle would have a hard time explaining to a judge why he was suing the person who had cared for his mother while he was absent. My attorney suggested I respond with a simple letter declining to pay and outlining the circumstances that led to my decision. He also recommended I document everything: the years of caregiving, the family's absence during my grandmother's illness, and the events at the funeral reception. Update 3. 2 weeks after the funeral, something unexpected happened. My grandmother's lawyer called to schedule a reading of her will. I had assumed she had little to leave behind. Her house had been sold to pay for medical expenses, and her savings had been depleted by years of healthcare costs. I was wrong. Apparently, my grandmother had been far more astute than any of us realized. Years ago, when she first got sick, she had quietly liquidated some investments and set up a trust fund. She had also taken out a life insurance policy that none of us knew about. The total value of her estate was just over $180,000. The will reading was scheduled for the following Monday. My uncle and aunt would be there, along with several cousins and myself. The lawyer mentioned that my grandmother had made some specific bequests and had left detailed instructions about the distribution of her assets. I spent the weekend wondering what she might have left me. Maybe a small keepsake, or perhaps a few $1,000s to help me get back on my feet after years of caregiving. I try not to get my hopes up, but I couldn't help thinking about how the money could help me restart my career and rebuild my life. Monday arrived, and I found myself sitting in the same conference room where I had signed medical power of attorney documents 3 years earlier. My uncle and aunt were there, along with 4 cousins. The atmosphere was tense. No one had spoken to me since the funeral incident, and I could feel their resentment radiating across the room. The lawyer began by reading the standard legal language, then moved on to the specific bequests. My grandmother had left small amounts to various charities and a few $1,000s to each of her grandchildren for education expenses. Then came the big surprise. She had left the bulk of her estate, $165,000, to me. The room erupted. My uncle immediately stood up and demanded to know how this was possible. My aunt started crying, saying it wasn't fair, that the money should be divided equally among all the grandchildren. The cousins sat in stunned silence, processing the fact that their absent relationship with their grandmother had cost them significantly. The lawyer calmly explained that my grandmother had been very specific in her instructions. She had left a sealed letter to be read aloud, explaining her decision. In her own words, she thanked me for sacrificing my life to care for her when no one else would. She acknowledged that her other children and grandchildren had their own lives and priorities, but she wanted to ensure that my devotion didn't go unrewarded. The letter went on to say that she hoped the inheritance would help me rebuild the life I had put on hold for her sake. She also mentioned that she was proud of the man I had become and that she knew I would use the money wisely and with the same compassion I had shown her. My uncle was furious. He accused me of manipulating a sick old woman, of isolating her from the rest of the family, of somehow coercing her into changing her will. The lawyer firmly corrected him, explaining that the will had been drafted 3 years ago, shortly after my grandmother's diagnosis, and that she had been of sound mind at the time. As we left the lawyer's office, my uncle made one final attempt to guilt me into sharing the inheritance. He argued that family should support each other, that my grandmother would have wanted the money to benefit everyone, not just one person. He suggested we could split it evenly and put the whole ugly situation behind us. I looked at him for a long moment, remembering all the times I had called him during my grandmother's illness, asking for help, for visits, for any kind of support. I thought about the months I had spent alone with her, watching her fade away while her children lived their lives 2 hours away. I remembered the funeral reception, the laughter when I was excluded, the assumption that I would pay for everything while being treated as an outsider. I told him that my grandmother had already made her wishes clear, both in life and in death. She had chosen to leave her money to the person who had chosen to stay with her when everyone else chose to leave. I said I planned to honor her decision just as I had honored her while she was alive. Then I walked away from my family for the last time. The $2,900 reception bill never did get paid by me. My uncle's lawyer never followed through on the threatened lawsuit. And I used my grandmother's inheritance to start over in a new city, far from the relatives who had shown me exactly what family meant to them. Sometimes the best revenge isn't elaborate or dramatic. Sometimes it's just walking away and letting people face the consequences of their own choices. My grandmother understood that, and in her final act of love, she made sure I had the means to do exactly that. I still miss her every day, but I'm no longer angry. She taught me that family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about showing up when it matters. And in the end, she showed up for me one last time, even after she was gone.